Everybody, boy, it's Anthony Brogdon on the one and twos. And man, I got a smooth dude on the channel today. One of them PhD persons at an prestigious university here in the state of Michigan, the Go Wolverines, the U of M. And he likes jazz too. And I noticed because I saw him in a jazz concert. We were grooving. He was up dancing and I was dancing and we got to talking and here we are. And I'm telling you, everybody, I could tell something was about this guy because he looked distinguished. And so I stuck with a conversation and I told him, about what I'm doing in the book. He said, let me tell you what I'm doing, my friend. And here we are today on Strong Inspirations. I'm Anthony Brogdon, where I give it to you straight, no chaser. I just asked a few questions and let these experts, these smart people, do the talking. These people who are conscious, who want you to hear some good history, to hear the good history of Black folks in around the world. So, everybody, I am excited to have him on the show today. A couple of things I just want to, do a little housekeeping on that. I got a lot of stuff going on my personal tip, everybody. And the big thing that I'm doing that I want you to get ready for, I'm producing, directing, and I wrote a movie. All right? And it's called They Did It. And it's about rich Black folks that lived in the 1800s and some in the 1900s. And it's going to blow your mind. Watch, it's coming out soon. We are in production. We've already begun filming. We got maybe 3-4 more days to go, some edit, and there it will be. You'll be able to watch us on the streaming service on your television and on Amazon on your computer. And then we're going to have a premiere here in Detroit, which is where I'm based, but we're also going to have one in Atlanta, New York, and LA, them entertainment hubs, so the word can get out. So stay tuned for that. And my friends, if you're so inclined, you can get your name in the film's credits just by buying a patron ad. It's my fundraiser. Go to my website, Business in the Black, and all this will be on that site and tell you how you can do it and be a part of They Did It, my friends, because they did do it and we still doing it. I was on the radio last night and I told the guy, I said, I want to keep this program 100% positive. I did my very best and then it went downhill after that, but that's another story. It's hard for us to do that sometimes. And that's kind of leading into what my guest is going to talk about today. It's the mindset of people and how we've been conditioned over the years. You're going to love this interview because when he told me what he was talking about and what he writes about and what he teaches, I said, man, please come on. But before I have him on, I want to let you know another movie. This one is titled Business in the Black, The Rise of Black Business in America. Somehow I found out, because they didn't tell me this in school at no level, that there were enslaved Black folks who owned businesses. I had not heard that. And so when I found out, I did this documentary. Took me 2 years to do it. And then I took it to over 40 cities across America. And then some people said, hey, can you put it in written form? And boom, shakalaka. That's where I came up with Black Business Book. My guest bought one on the spot, everybody. And I invite you to do it. Go to the website, businessintheblack.net, and it talks about some of that stuff that happened to us that messed with our mindset, and some of that stuff that happened to us that increased our mindset and made us more proficient. Yeah, he's got a copy right there.
Got a copy right here.
Got a copy right there, everybody. Businessintheblack.net. It's America's #1 Black business history book on the market. This book going down in history along with my film. Now, you hear me use this term strong a lot. Strong is my favorite word. I wish my middle name was Strong. And in my world, strong stands for strength, tenacity, resilience, and a sense of oneness, nobility, and grace. And that is my introduction to my guest today. Come on, strong man. Tell us your name. Let's get it on.
Brother Anthony, I appreciate the warm introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation, too, to join you today. First, I want to start off by saying congratulations on all the success and the movie project that's coming through. So,
yes, thank you.
just
Thank
added
you.
to a fine list of great accomplishments and milestones. So, we're all
Yes,
proud of you,
thank you.
brother.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Now, tell us your name. Tell us your name.
All right, so my name is Dr. Myles Durkee. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Michigan in the psychology department. My research looks at racial stress that people of color experience in their day-to-day lives, both racial stress they experience within their racial group and also with outside of their racial group as well, too. So look at
Okay.
how people adjust to different contexts, adjust different parts of their self-presentation, and how Black they are in different spaces to fit in, and the psychological implications of that adjustment of being Black in different contexts.
Okay. Now, before we get into that, we're gonna rock on that note. I gotta ask a couple questions about you. So my guests get to know where were you born and raised?
So I was born and raised in Pasadena, California, so a
Okay.
suburb right outside of Los Angeles.
Do you know was it a Black neighborhood that you know that kind of thing?
So
What
historically, Pasadena was predominantly white, but it has diversified over the years. So now it's a combination of Black, white, and Latino.
did you go to I guess a mixed neighborhood
So I
you grew
lived
up
in
in?
a mostly white neighborhood, but I went to public schools, and the public schools are predominantly Black, Latino, and white.
Oh, is that
So,
right?
like I've been in diverse school contexts for up until I got to college. And
Yes,
that was really
yes.
the first time that I'd adjust to predominantly white, school environments.
Is there Black history in Pasadena and California that got you to kind of think the way you did? How did you shape to come to this formation in your life?
Yeah, I mean, the Black churches are very active in Pasadena. We have a very active NAACP,
Oh,
chapter
really?
that actually gave me a scholarship to college to help me, pay for the expenses of undergrad. So I mean, yeah, so there's like a thriving, Black community within Pasadena that's really, close knit, and everybody's just 1 or 2 degrees of separation. So if you don't know
Sure,
them,
sure,
then they know your mama, they know your auntie, like so
sure, sure,
pretty,
sure.
close knit.
It,
Yeah, suburban neighborhood right outside of downtown LA.
is there a Black history story out of Pasadena though? Is there some racial strife that ever happened? Some riots? Some any of
Oh
those kind of
yeah.
things?
I mean, as soon as the Black folks came to Pasadena and Altadena, there was white flight immediately. So a lot of the,
Really?
white population started to leave Pasadena, Altadena, and went to Orange County, as like the new stronghold. That was the destination for white flight. So yeah, so Pasadena has its issues, definitely with police and redlining and, all those things that, enact the will of, let's say white supremacists and racists. So there is, uh, there's some
Did,
dirt in history, I'll be honest.
okay. Did you ever experience anything in your life by chance that
Oh, definitely racial profiling. Like
oh
absolutely.
really?
Yeah. So, yep. So my family lived on the top of the hill, side of a mountain. So driving home, getting home, police asking, "What are you doing here? You don't belong in this neighborhood," the whole 9 yards. Assuming that I sold drugs, all the things. So that was just kind of like, being a Black youth in LA in general, too. Like I don't think there's any parts of LA you can even live in, whether it's a, affluent neighborhood or not, where being Black, in that context, you get stopped by the
Yeah.
police, fortunately, quite often. And I think we say that same experience in a lot of, larger cities across the country of just racial profiling and stop and frisk.
Okay. I'm gonna delve into this just and I mean no disrespect in it. Being in Pasadena, did you go in LA? Did you go into the hood in LA or you kind of stayed away from it or was it
But I'll be
exciting? Did
honest.
you know some of that hood?
Yeah, I'll be honest. Like I was sheltered, growing up in the suburb
Okay.
right outside of LA. I was definitely sheltered for most of my upbringing. But as soon as I got my first car, senior year of high school, that gave me a lot of freedom. So that was when I
Okay.
spent the majority of my time in LA was being mobile by having a car.
This gonna lead into the discussion. Growing up as you did, how does Black kids not turn into where they lose their identity? You
Mm,
follow what my question is?
yeah.
And being away from Blacks. on those other rungs of life? How does that happen, or how do they do it? What have you? What's your research say in that regard?
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting dynamic because for many Black folks, I mean, at some point, you move outside of the neighborhood you grew up in. And a lot of times you're moving into more predominantly white spaces, whether that's going away to college, or after you graduate from college, getting that first, professional job where now you're in a predominantly white workplace, or, maybe when it comes to buying your own home and buying into, a suburban neighborhood as well, too. So as we move kind of further and further away from, our home environments we grew up in, it takes this adjustment and negotiation of, okay, how do I carry myself in this space? How do I speak to white people? Should I code switch and change the way I'm, naturally carry myself to make other folks feel more comfortable around me, or to get better customer service when I'm in these different spaces and places? Should I speak more proper so that they treat me with the respect that I deserve? So it's definitely a tough negotiation. It's not every person chooses the same answer, whether they decide to code switch or not. It's really a personal decision, but it does have implications for the identity for sure. I mean, for those who feel forced to have to code switch and do it
And
and
you hold to
begrudge.
use that word code switch. What does that mean?
Yeah, great question. My bad. Yeah, so code switch is the process of adjusting your behavior to fit the norms or the expectations of the context you're in or the audience of people you're talking to. So historically, a lot of the code switching occurs with the way you talk. All right. So right now I'm talking in a mainstream American English way, the way that, probably most folks would be talking when they're at work or in an interview like this is right
Sure,
now.
sure, sure,
But when I'm not in this type of situation, I'm gonna sound a little different, when I'm
sure.
around my family, my friends, and them. So traditionally, code switching is just changing the way you speak, whether that's switching between different languages or different dialects within the same language. So switching between a more African American, style of English versus a mainstream American style of English. That's gonna sound a little more proper.
So you use that word code switch. When black people talk proper, some
Mhm.
other black people say you trying to act white.
Mhm.
What's that? How does that? What is that? What does that mean? Is that what's your take on it?
Yeah, so that's the other line of our research is looking at. So we call them cultural invalidations. And these cultural invalidations occur when someone tries to discredit your authenticity with a group that you identify or belong to. So that can occur like in your racial authenticity. So if you're carrying yourself in a way that other people don't perceive is typical or stereotypical for Black folks and being a Black person, then they can accuse you of acting white by not being authentic or Black enough in that case.
Yeah,
Um, so a lot of people are vulnerable to being accused of, acting white or not being perceived as authentic for the racial group. Because when you think about it, what we tend to normalize or expect from folks a lot of times are being informed by those stereotypes that we've been socialized to believe about certain groups. So when we meet someone who doesn't fit our expectations of how we typically expect someone of a group, even within our race or outside our race to behave, then it kind of creates a sense of a little cognitive dissonance there where we're like, something's off here. This doesn't seem the way I was expected to. So
yeah.
that's most often when we see both. It happens often in middle school ages, teenage years, but often even sometimes in adulthood too, where people, based on the way they speak, the way they carry themselves, their music interests, their dancing abilities, how they dress, kind of all these different attributes we've racialized in our society. And we expect certain cultural groups and racial groups to fit a certain kind of profile within all those categories. And when someone doesn't fit that profile and they're a person of color, we find that oftentimes they can be accused of acting white.
Yeah. Well, now, what's a historical perspective? What does this do with slavery or any of those kind of things? Is there some background that you can speak on in that regard?
I mean, this whole acting white accusation is definitely a repercussion of, essentially white supremacy, particularly in America. And the reason why is because when we think of what are American norms and standards of behaviors of just American, all right? For most people, we automatically associate that with the norms and standards and practices of white Americans as kind of like the default American that is the default for all bases of comparison. So because of that, that puts, white cultural standards and norms and tendencies and preferences on a pedestal as like the default in which everyone else is compared to. All right. And then for other ethnic minority groups, we kind of pigeonhole them, and typically our expectations for their attributes and mannerisms is often seen as inferior, and also it pulls on kind of the negative expectations in that way. So when, let's say, like a person of color, like a Black youth who's an avid reader and loves to read, when we see them with a book in their hand or like a nerd or in the library, rather than just saying, oh, that's a Black youth who's, really into, let's say nerdy things.
Yes.
Unfortunately, we all by default, oftentimes, a lot of times accuse that Black youth of acting white, because they're
Yeah.
not fitting the expectations that we would expect of a Black person. So historically in the research, the acting white accusation, we looked at it heavily in the academic achievement kind of realm. So we looked at it within schools to answer the question of, are Black youth purposely not applying themselves for the fear that their peers might accuse them of acting white.
Oh,
So that
really?
hypothesis has been challenged a lot and discredited. So we find that for high achieving Black youth, even if they're accused of acting white, our research shows it too, they still maintain they're still high achieving. All right. So they don't let that impair their academic performance. Some students are still heavily stressed out by it. We see consistently that it still does affect their mental health and well-being because it's a racial insult nonetheless. But for some students, they channel that frustration and now trying to disprove these negative academic stereotypes that we put on Black folks by trying to break through that glass ceiling, or
Yeah.
break into that leader of a Fortune 500 company, or to be the
Yes.
next, president or vice president of the country.
Sure, sure. Now, one of the things I've had a number of people on the show who are who are from the Gullah Geechee Corps community, and so there will be Black people saying, "Don't talk Gullah Geechee because you're talking stupid," but what they're doing is discriminating against that culture.
Mm-hmm.
So there's levels within the Black community of that one. The Black saying you got to talk the way I talk, and if you don't, you talk Gullah Geechee. Now you less than I am.
Yeah, and that's the tricky situation when it comes to these, like cultural invalidations, where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. Okay.
Yes.
Because if you don't sound that way and you only speak in one dialect that is mainstream American English and sounds more proper, now you're going to be accused of acting white and not being authentic enough and not being familiar with the culture, not being down for the cause and the culture. But on the flip side, if you only know how to speak an African American type of vernacular that, let's say we call it Ebonics, that's the only way, then you can be villainized for that too, of not being perceived as less educated or less professional, less qualified. So really, it creates this pressure for Black folks where we have to be so adaptive just to exist and thrive in this country, where we have to shipshape and adapt ourselves to fit in different contexts. Because if we're too far on any extreme, then we're still going to be pigeonholed in that way.
Yeah. Again, when we talk about it from a historical perspective, back in the day, understandably, there were Black folks who couldn't read and write, and so you knew they could. I mean, understandably, they couldn't adjust and be able to talk. But there was a big fight among them to get an education. Why would we suspect that they thought so hardly to want to get an education?
I mean, if we go back to slavery, getting an education could be a death sentence, So
Yeah.
no one had to read, left you vulnerable to get murdered by, white supremacists.
Yeah.
So, I mean, systemically, I would say our US government has, over time, always been cautious about Black people getting overly educated or informed or becoming, more woke, and conscious about the systems of oppression that our society, unfortunately thrives on, and it's built upon that system of oppression and keeping us oppressed in that way. So there's always been a sense of, our government and our society not having our best interest in mind. But even within that, we've been such a resilient people, to thrive
Yes.
in the worst and unexpected and unimaginable conditions. Because I mean, we're such a resilient culture and such a powerful culture and powerful people that even given the worst circumstances, we're still going to find a way to uplift ourselves.
I love it.
That can come in many different ways. Education is one form of that uplifting, but also just spiritually, that connection with our
Yes.
communities, our, the way that we look out for one another. And I think one of the recent events that occurred was the Riverboat Brawl that happened in
Yes.
Alabama. We
Yes.
did see that connection amongst Black folks who didn't even know each other, but still
Sure.
there was a need there, and that community
Yes.
rallied together in that way. Now, I don't condone violence, but in that
Yes.
situation where,
Yes.
a Black man at work was jumped by a group of white individuals, the community
Yes.
really responded in a way to help that.
Yes. Over the years, and again, I'm staying on the historical before we move up the timeline. Over the years, much of the education that was available to Blacks was through the HBCUs.
Mm-hmm.
But then they began to open it up for white institutions. Well, is there a different dynamic if you can say, and maybe your research of attending an HBCU compared to a white institution, if I
Yeah,
can
no, I
use
think
that
that
term, white institution.
yeah, no, I think that plays a major role. So I can speak from the data we had. So it actually was a pilot test in which we launched data collection at a large, predominantly white university and uh, a very selective historically Black college and university. And then we wanted to see, do Black college students experience these cultural invalidations differently? And from the pilot study, I mean, we found that yes, it really does make a difference. So what was really fascinating is that once you're in an environment where there's less and less Black folks in that space, now the pressure to have to represent your group appropriately and in the best light, that
Okay.
pressure intensifies as your group becomes smaller. So when we look at predominantly white institutions, for the few Black students that are at some of these institutions, in many of their classes, they may be the only Black person in that class. So now, as the Black community in that school, you want to make sure that every single Black person falls in line and there's a high level of cultural policing to make sure that they're all representing the group in the way that you determine is the best way to represent our group. So that's where we see these kind of checks and balances of accusing folks of acting white when they go too far off, let's say in the code switching or speaking too properly and kind of forgetting about that culture. Or if they're, too stereotypically Black, then we're also going to see that checks and balance too to make sure that they're representing the group the right way. Because what's at stake there is the reputation of the whole group. Because if one person has a bad reputation, that now reflects on the reputation of the entire racial group. Now, things switch when your group's in the majority context. When we look at historically HBCU context where, Black is the majority, all that pressure now to have to represent your entire racial group just immediately disappears, because one of the benefits of being in the majority group is now you start to become the default. And when you are the default racial group, now you get the freedom of being perceived as an individual. So if one of the groups of the members is, let's say, Jamal's just, not represent our group in the best light. All right. In that case, then in a HBCU context, we're going to judge him as Jamal. All right. Because he's not representing the whole group because our group is the majority. So we're
Right.
going to treat him more and stereotype him or judge him as an individual. But let's say Jamal's now at a predominantly white university where he's one of only a few. Now, based on Jamal's behavior, we're going to generalize that to the entire racial group. All right. So there's a huge difference and the stakes are different there. And that kind of speaks to why we see students at predominantly white universities tend to encounter these types of invalidations like acting white, and also that pressure to code switch is intensified.
What have you found to be that how much pressure that is? I mean, that's a big load on your shoulders, and you've seen people in your research crumble under that, I suspect. And what's been their response? The students under that pressure. That's the question.
Yeah, so the vast majority of our data, I'll admit, has been at predominantly white institutions.
Yes.
We've recruited from many predominantly white institutions all over the country, but we see a same general pattern. And that stress is a lot more toxic. One, because being a Black student in a predominantly white space, it's that sense of insecurity with their identity or just trying to negotiate your identity in that space becomes really difficult on one end. Because on one end, you want to maintain those strong cultural ties with your own cultural group to have that, that safe space, that foundation of, building that Black community in that predominantly white context. But on the other hand, you have to find a way to also assimilate into the campus culture and to interact, with the majority group. So that may require some additional pressure to have to code switch. But if you code switch too extremely, then your own group might start to ostracize you or accuse you of acting
Yeah.
white. So
Sure.
it's a
Sure.
constant negotiation of what's the right type of Black and how Black should I be. All right. So like if we put Blackness on a continuum or a threshold, so many students in these contexts are trying to figure out, okay, which version of me should I be? And what's the right version? And we see this kind of this internal identity conflict play out. And we see it play out in their mental health, their depressive symptoms, their anxiety symptoms. One thing that we aren't seeing, though, is that their academic performance is pretty protected. So, I mean, these students still are, even though they're experiencing this stress and we're seeing it affecting them health-wise, they're still maintaining that academic performance where even when they do experience these, you're acting white, you're a nerd, whatever, they're not letting that deter them from accomplishing the goal that they came there
I
to
love it.
get that degree.
I
So
love
that's
it.
a positive outcome that we do find from it. But
let
it
me,
can wreak havoc in their social ties and relationships with their peers, their sense of
yes.
belonging in the campus in general, and overall their mental health. We see pretty consistently does take a toll there.
Let me flip this question from another perspective. What is the majority's attitude towards blacks when from various ways? Let's say when the guy acts too black, that's one question. And
Mhm.
when that guy acts too white, what have you found them? Not, and I shouldn't say too white, but when he assimilates, let's call it
Yeah,
that.
yeah, exactly. No, I
What
mean,
happens? What have you interviewed any of them to see what their thoughts were on this?
so we haven't interviewed white participants, but we have asked Black and Latinx students about their experiences being accused of acting white and receiving these types of cultural validations. And we find that when they're at predominantly white colleges, they get these accusations from white students at these schools too.
Is that
So I
right?
think we assume that these are only happening within the racial group amongst their own community of kind of that cultural policing. But no, those same accusations happen from the majority group. And typically, what happens is when a majority group individual accuses a person of color of acting white, usually they mask it in it's like a double-sided compliment, all right, or a backhanded compliment. Well, they'll say, "Hey, you're not like the rest of your group.
Yes.
You're normal, kind of like me. Yeah, you're more like
Right.
white and normal than anyone else." But
Right.
they don't see how that's problematic. That is an insult at the end of the day.
Yes. Yes.
Or sometimes they compliment the person like, "Wow, you're so articulate. Like,
Right.
you're not what I expect, or not like other black people," things like that.
Yes.
So
Yes.
from their mind, they see them as complimenting the person, but at the same time, they just now disrespected their entire stereotype, their entire racial group. So ultimately, these Black and Latinx students, they still internalize that as a racial insult. Nonetheless, even if it is masked and a compliment, they see that as stressful. It still affects their depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms over time. Even over we found that even over a year period in college, it still predicts their mental health in a negative direction. But we did find that when that same insult does occur from a member of your same racial group, it does sting significantly more. And the
Oh,
reason
I
we
can
believe
imagine.
why it tends to be more detrimental for your mental health when it does come from a member of your own racial group is because not only is that a racial insult, but it also carries with it the sense of cultural betrayal, where now you feel that your own group is seeing you as betraying the prototypical norms and standards and the ways you should carry yourself that the group expects. And that can lead to greater ostracism with your own racial or ethnic community.
And with that being the case, if you had a child, and I'm just saying hypothetically, what what would be your ideal way to raise that child to tell them how to assimilate?
Great question. So I get a variant of that question a lot from undergrads and students of color at University of Michigan. It's a lot from the freshmen who are coming in, and basically this dilemma of, I mean, when you enroll at a predominantly white university, you kind of know what you're getting into. You know it's going to be a heavily white space. But once you arrive there on day one on campus, you still have to make that decision. Okay, should I code switch? Should I change the way I am to adapt to this space? Or should I say, you know what? Forget that. I'm gonna keep it 100. I'm gonna be me. Either you're gonna love me or you're gonna hate me. But when
Right.
you do that, you also risk facing some consequences of being ostracized or pigeonholed or maybe profiled by campus security, at a higher rate than if you assimilated in code switch. So both options have their pros and cons. All right. They both carry a different set of benefits and a different set of consequences. So the students hate the answer I give them, where it's such a personal decision. I can never tell them what's the right way to do or the wrong way to do. I can tell them what the potential, likely benefits and consequences are for either decision. But what really matters is I have them self reflect on what feels natural. Okay. So if you were just to go about your day to day, in this campus, would you feel naturally inclined to adjust the way that you're behaving because it makes you less stressed out and anxious? Or do you feel more comfortable just being the way you would be anyway and just, uh, having other people adjust to you in that way? So it's
Okay.
really just if you can find what feels more comfortable with you, then ask them to lean in on that. And for different folks, sometimes it does feel more comfortable simply for them to code switch, because there's that fear of, I don't want to be stereotyped. I don't want to be, perceived in that way. But for other folks, that stress of having the code switch is just overwhelming, where that's just not sustainable and healthy if it constantly feels like a burden. I will say over time, that gets easier to do. Like any other thing, it's like a skill. If you're doing it day after day after day, it just gets easier to put on that profile. But getting started off, it's stressful for everyone. No one's born knowing how to do this negotiation. So if I had a child who was coming up, and what we naturally see is most children, they typically mirror what their parents did. So I think what a lot of parents don't realize is that even if you never have an explicit conversation about code switching and assimilating to kind of like white standards and expectations, your children are already observing, what do you do in those spaces when you interact with white folks? So if the parents already kind of switch up their behavior, then even without having that conversation, their children have already observed that, taken note, and they're like, all right, when I get that age or when I get my first job, they'll most likely replicate or copy the same exact behavioral dynamics. For me, when I noticed my parents code switching was when I was a young child. I think I was maybe only like 5 or 6. I got in trouble at school and had to call my mom. You know that call when you call the parents at work. So I was already nervous. So they actually just dialed the number and then put me on the phone. So the crazy part was I called my mom's direct line, but this white lady answered her phone. And I was like, oh, okay. I was like, oh, excuse me. I was like, can you connect me with my mom? And then it was my mom who picked up the phone and she said, hey, baby, it's me. And she switched her voice completely from the
Oh,
voice
so you didn't even know.
with. I didn't recognize my own mom on the phone because she answered the voice with her work voice, you know, and that was her code switching voice.
Yes.
But it was so, I mean, she had practiced it over, we're talking like over a decade. Like it was so
sure.
that you would not know that that wasn't, you wouldn't know that that was a Black woman on the phone. I mean, she sounded just like a white woman on the phone. To the point that I didn't even know that white woman who answered the phone.
Yeah.
So when she switched up, like I felt like even more nervous, like, oh, I'm sorry, mom. What voice was that?
Right.
But like those little things, children start to notice that, and you take notes, and they kind of bank it in their long-term memory to kind of give them some guidance on how they might want to carry themselves when they're in similar situations.
Let me ask you this: if there's a, and I guess it's probably you can't say 100%, but when white people see Black people and they don't act Black enough, or they code switch too far, do you suspect that in the back of the room they say, man, that guy has sold out because he don't even respect his own people? You get my question?
Yeah, I get your question. So once again, these are generalizations, so it's going to be a lot of individual difference amongst white folks. But yes, that does happen sometimes where we do see, and we have some data on that too, where sometimes, you know, Black and Latinx students at predominantly white universities who are, you know, adapting to that context, they can be called out by some of their white peers of just, you know, not being a true representative of their race.
Yes, right.
But on the other time too, we also see that, you know, as natural human beings, we're more socially inclined and we have more positive perceptions around other people who are similar to us. So things that we have in common and similarities, basically, so it's we call it the halo effect sometimes, and it's the in-group bias that all people have. So when someone else, we see them to have the same traits or tendencies, or we know that they are an in-group member in that way, we tend to associate more, just they get the benefit of the doubt, and we just associate positive traits with that individual. We're going to evaluate them more positively. So with that said, for I would say a lot of white folks, when they encounter a person who can talk the same way they can carry themselves the same way, is already familiar with the same social and cultural attributes as them, then in that case, they tend to be a little more warm towards that person because they start to see themselves in that person, even if they come from a different racial group. So one key example of how far this can get you is if we look at Barack Obama. He's like always like the unicorn code switcher that I go to as example, is that what's great about Barack Obama is he can code switch any way, any direction, and he does it in real time, instantly, and it just seems genuine and authentic, where you don't even know he's code switching. You think that that is the true Barack Obama when you interact with him, unless you see him interacting with a different group. You see he's doing it to a different group.
I got you.
But he has a natural ability to be able to read a room, read the audience, see the dynamics, and he mirrors that right back to the audience in real time and gives them a version of themselves. And when you do that to people, they naturally, either unconsciously and sometimes consciously, they're more drawn to that because they start to see themselves in you.
Yeah, because I've seen him do it, in news clips where he was in a room and it was some Black guys and the white guys, he shook their hand in the white guy format. And then the brothers, he gave them a shoulder bump. And he just, I mean, it was like white guy here, brother there. And he shoulder bumped the brother right immediately, but did not do the white guy immediately after that. Exactly. Let me ask you this question. Throughout history, there have been a lot of white people who have helped black plight. What made them be that way? If I may ask that question, you know what I mean? Like the John Browns who
Mhm.
gave of his life to help fight slavery in Kansas and so on and so forth, and others who marched with Dr. King. What made
Yeah.
them be that way?
Yeah, so I'll say there's probably two factors that I would say are probably driving this dynamic the most. The first and probably most common is simply just white guilt, of
Oh, is that
realizing,
right?
how atrocious, the white cultural group has been towards other groups. And then trying to make sense and cope with that guilt. One's natural reaction is, I need to do something. All right. I need to make up for all the atrocities that my group has done. Let me do something to help. So I think that is definitely a driving factor.
Okay.
The other driving factor, too, is just familiarity with the group. And I think in our country, that's why segregation was pushed and forced for so long, because the systems that be, and I'll say the man was terrified as if we have, white communities sharing, interacting significantly with black communities, and they're of the same kind of social economic status, or go to the same church, then they'll just naturally start to see, hey, we're a lot more similar than we are different. All right. So we're actually
Yeah.
fighting for the same thing of we want to create a great, community and, raise our children in a safe environment and have them, give the best opportunities for them. So when you start to interact with other groups on an equal footing, so you have to have the same power dynamics. When you have differential power dynamics, that intergroup contact is not quality contact. But when you have equal power dynamics, then you start to see people really connect with one another. And the more time they spend with each other, they start to naturally pick up different tendencies of the other group. So then
Right.
in that case, if you have a white individual who, let's say, has spent a lot of time in black neighborhoods, maybe went to predominantly black schools, when you see them interacting, other white people may see them as, oh, Timmy or Todd, he acts black. Like he acts just
Right.
like the black people.
Right.
And in
Right.
that case, it's not that, Todd is trying to act black. It's just that he spent significant time in that context and just naturally picked up, the dialect, the swang, the charisma, the swag. Like
Yeah.
it just
Yeah.
happens as human nature. But as an unfortunate consequence of our residential neighborhoods and our schools still being so heavily segregated, even to this day, we don't have a lot of significant intergroup, interracial interaction between different groups.
There's always been that dynamic where it throughout slavery. Now they say Abraham Lincoln really didn't want to end slavery. He just didn't really want the country to divide like it would have
Yeah,
been with the
trying to
South
unite the
and so on
country
and so forth.
and
But
economic reasons too.
and it was much more economic than that institution. What but there have been various religious organizations such and I'll name the first one that comes to mind is the Quakers
Yeah,
that really did a lot. Was that a religious component or a love for mankind? What do you think that might have been?
I think so. I mean, it's hard to be a highly religious, immoral person, but then still view another human being as just property that can be
Yes.
disposed of. I mean, those two things are not congruent with each other.
Right. 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 Right.
Um, so I think that's why. I mean, I think most Christian Southerners had to, convince themselves and almost create, a counterfactual, beliefs of still being religious, but then condoning slavery, because
Yes.
those two issues, I mean, slavery is not ethical in any sense. So there's definitely a disconnect there. And I think the Quakers realized that, just seeing the value in human life and respecting human beings. And with that, it's hard to, be in support of slavery when you have that moralistic view of valuing human life.
That goes. I'm going a little more deeper on you as we almost kind of come to a close. And my deeper on you is this way. There were the enslavers who were raping a lot of black women. Well, how could you justify I hate them so bad and then do that?
Yeah.
Can you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I know that's a deep question, but I always
I
wondered that.
mean, trying to make sense with the psychology of slavery, like it's just it's mind blowing. A group that you demonize so much, but yet you want to fornicate with the and take advantage and
Yes,
abuse the women in that
yes,
group too, and create offspring too. Like let's not forget,
yes,
there were a ton
yes,
of biracial children
yes,
that were the product of rape during
yes,
slavery,
yes,
and then still not claiming or yeah, claiming those children. So
yes.
I mean, it's I think it's naturally as human beings, like psychologically, it's hard to make sense with this because these things are not congruent. They don't fit with each other. They don't but so once again, going back to this is a cognitive dissonance where your behaviors and your beliefs aren't really fitting with each other. They're not matching with each other. There's a string disconnect here. And naturally, that creates stress in individuals. So the more cognitive dissonance that you're encountering where your behaviors aren't fitting with your religious beliefs and your morals and your values, that just creates a lot of internal conflict that can lead to other more detrimental psychological outcomes down the road.
What classes do you are you a teach? You teach?
Yeah,
So you
absolutely.
teach what?
So my biggest undergraduate course is Intro to Personality Psychology. So we talk about just all the unique and vast individual differences in human personalities, and what some of the patterns are and the science behind studying personality, and what it predicts to, and what it's correlated with as well.
Uh,
Another class I teach is a doctoral seminar on cultural and structural racism. So that class is really fun. It's taught in collaboration with Racism Lab at the University of Michigan, which is an interdisciplinary research lab that studies racism in our society to explain racial inequalities and the implications and consequences of racism.
like in either one of those instances, what's the difference between an A and you got a C or a D? You didn't do the work. You didn't understand these proper the terms that you need to understand because it is a science,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, so at U of M, I mean, a lot of our students are extremely high achieving. Some of them too much of a perfectionist where they're like, I have to get an A or A plus.
right,
Sometimes they can be very anal.
right.
So it's like typically rare that students, receive, let's say like C's, D's, or failing grades, I would
Right,
say.
right,
And typically when that does happen, it's students either having a lot of absences, not turning in assignments.
right.
Even then too, a lot of my courses, I mean, we allow for late work to be turned in, but if you don't
Sure.
get it in by,
Yeah,
at
sure,
all, then,
sure,
I
sure.
mean, some points are better than 0 points. So
But I guess what I'm driving at is what do you judge them on? Do they get your concept? Do they express their own concept?
So it depends on the course. So if this is an intro level course, like intro to personality, then really what we're measuring is your just understanding of the material. All right. Because we're introducing a lot of material in a short amount of time. And basically we have to, measure through, tests and papers, and some projects of, you know, how are you internalizing this material, and can you apply this material to? So in a lot of my exam questions, rather than having someone simply define a term, which is
Right.
just memorizing a definition, our key is really to see, okay, can you now apply this construct in a real life scenario? All right, or if I give you a
Okay.
vignette or a story about a situation, can you identify the theory or the concept that we studied in class from this description of a real life situation? So in that case, then it's moving beyond simply just memorization to application of the material.
Got you. I got
So
you.
that's what I strive for. When we look at more graduate courses, that's when we get a lot more into theory. So especially in my doctoral seminars, we're talking a lot about theory, and talking about books and research articles. And really the goal there is, okay, how can we further complicate and push theories forward and to advance the science overall? So in that
Yeah.
case, students are writing a lot more papers,
Oh,
and these
I got
papers
you.
really critiquing, evaluating theories, and really trying to provide new knowledge that we don't know yet, and creating new conceptual frameworks.
Yeah, I will admit again. I mean, no disrespect in this question. The things that you've said only make sense. You know what I mean? It's just common sense type stuff, I guess. I mean, say it that way. What have you learned something that you said I did not? This surprised me. Has somebody said? You know what I mean? Has somebody said that? Yeah, that's my question. Has something surprised you in your research?
Yeah, no, definitely. Like we run a fair amount of studies where the results come out the way we do not expect them to come out. Um, so one of the most recent results that we actually just obtained, from an experimental lab study is that we brought a group of undergrads into our research lab, and then we experimentally manipulated the social pressure within an environment where either they experienced direct pressure to code switch to a predominantly white panel that was evaluating them, or we prime them to just act natural, act authentic, and be themselves. And that by doing either of these prompts that we instructed in, we told them they'd be more likely to get a $5 bonus at the end of the study based on the feedback from the all white panel. So after this task, we had them complete, after they did an interview in front of the panel, we had them complete this difficult working memory task where it measures kind of cognitive load. And we expected for those who experience that pressure in that environment to have to code switch, that their performance should be impaired by now doing this working memory task because they're still ruminating about, okay, I'm in this code switching profile of having to present myself as a different racial group that requires cognitive resources, which should make it more difficult to complete this task. To our surprise, those who were still under that pressure completed the task significantly faster, who were still primed and pressured to have to code switch than the folks who we asked to just be natural and be authentic in that scenario. That goes completely against our hypothesis and prediction. So after completing the study, one reason why we think that might have happened is that we didn't necessarily realize how stressful telling someone to be natural and authentic can be when they're engaging in an interview. And no one's really authentic and natural in the interview. So what we think was happening is this: for the folks who plan to be authentic and natural in the interview, right before going to the interview, we got their self-reports. They intended to be natural and authentic for that interview. But by the end of the interview, we asked them once again the same question of what were your intentions. And in fact, everyone code switched. So even if
Okay.
they plan to be natural and authentic, I think interviews are stressful. A lot of people defaulted back to what felt safe, which was the code switching and that environment of having an all-white panel evaluate you, being a Black student.
Yeah.
So I think that negotiation in their mind of being, okay, wanting to intend to be authentic, but then reverting back to code switching ultimately, because that just felt like a safer default. I think that internal kind of cognitive negotiation between, okay, what should I do? What should I do? Should I be authentic? Should I be myself? Should I change? I think that actually consumed more cognitive load and resources than if they just went into the whole scenario already knowing, like, you know what, I'm about to code switch, and then
Right.
staying in line in that code switching throughout the whole task.
What does your research do for uh what's the end game of it? What does it do? You know what I mean? You
Yeah, yeah,
want to prove
absolutely.
what to what? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So in this thing, like innovative research studies to like my family or to like community members, it's funny because they're like, you got to spend tens of thousands of dollars and do years of research just to show that code switching is stressful and it affects
Yeah,
the body.
right,
And I answered yes. And the
right.
reason we have to do that is because you'd be surprised the amount of pushback and backlash we got from this code switching research, where
Oh,
and typically the backlash comes from those in the most privileged and majority positions. So typically we get it from senior white males who are, chairs of the departments or in gatekeeping academic positions, where from their perspective, their perception of code switching is only switching between their natural casual self at home and their professional self at work. All right. And
oh,
everyone does that level of code switching. That's just
yeah,
human nature
sure,
to be more
sure,
professional at
sure,
work.
sure.
But since they've typically only, I mean, from their perspective, that's all they know about code switching. But for folks who come from more marginalized identities, and that can include your race, your gender, your socioeconomic status, your sexuality that you might have to mask and code in different situations, your religious background, even if you just grew up in the South and have a Southern accent and you're still white, but you move up to the Midwest or the North, there can still be pressure to have to mask that Southern accent because we vilify that Southern accent as being less
Yes,
educated.
yeah.
So for folks who now have more marginalized identities, and the more marginalized identities you have, it just starts to compound. There's greater pressure now that when you're in that professional space, not only are you switching to more professional standards, but you have to do it under a different personality, a different
Oh,
persona. You have to put on a different profile and
oh,
present yourself as a different way. Now that's a much higher level of code switching than simply casual professional self, because they're still
sure.
doing that. But now not only are they professional, but they're professional in a way that mirrors white men. Typically
Oh,
for the most part.
oh, okay, okay.
So having to convince, the majority group that this process is stressful, that's why it requires the evidence, the science, the studies that we
I
run.
got you. I
So
got you.
step one in most of our research is to prove that this stressor is real and that it exists, and that very rigorous scientific evidence shows that, look, this is taxing and toxic. Step two is trying to figure out, okay, now what are the coping mechanisms? Who are the people who thrive best in these situations? And then what can we draw and learn from them? All right. So if
Okay.
we understand how people can then adapt in these spaces and cope with them more effectively, now we can create more instructional programs. We can create pamphlets, advice, feedback to then
I
give that to
see.
the community, to other folks, to help them now transition into these spaces even easier and more seamlessly.
I
Um,
see. I
that's
see.
now getting towards interventions now of using that information to make it easier for future generations.
Yeah, I see. Oh, just a couple more questions. This one came into mind. Is code switching also your attire and your hairstyle, that kind of thing too?
Yes, absolutely. Code switching is your entire self presentation. Okay. So let me give you briefly just a little bit of background. So the term code switching came from the field of linguistics. And from linguistics, code switching was focusing on just simply linguistically. So the way you speak, switching between either multiple languages in a single conversation or two different dialects of the same language in that same conversation. So as we move forward a few decades now, as psychologists, we look at code switching, we realize that language is still very important, where as soon as you open up your mouth, people are already making assumptions about you of where you're
Right,
from, how educated you are, even maybe what they can pinpoint what geographic location you might be from, all
right,
from the way that you sound and the way you talk. But in addition to the simply style of speech, it's also the way that you carry yourselves, the way you walk, your clothing, your jewelry selection, your hairstyle. I mean, we see especially for Black women, code switching in terms of hairstyle is a very common dynamic that a lot of Black women have to negotiate. If I'm going on an interview, am I going to straighten and process my hair to appeal more
right,
to European
right,
standard? Or am I going to wear a natural hairstyle or wear my hair in locks or braids? Like
right.
these are, day-to-day or weekly negotiations that have to take place. But you can code switch your entire self-presentation. You can even code switch to your hobbies and interests. So
Okay.
personally, you may have no interest in golf or let's say tennis in the US Open. But if you know you're going on an interview where let's say the person interview is highly invested in golf or tennis, you
Yeah,
might code
sure,
switch and learn a little bit about those so that you can bring
sure,
that up in small talk during
sure,
that
sure,
interview. Or you
sure.
might go and learn how to golf, so that you can say,
Yeah,
hey, I
sure,
at this country
sure,
club. Things
sure.
like that. You can still code switch in your social preferences and hobbies and activities and behaviors as well.
As I can come to a close and promote you, do you have a book out or that type thing? That
Yeah, so no book. So my field is primarily research articles. So
okay,
we primarily publish research articles. I do have to admit in that a lot of them are locked behind paywalls at these research journal outlets. But I would say, my Twitter. So I try to retweet all the academic research that's related to
okay,
a
okay.
Black community or work that we do. And also to the research that comes out of my lab too. I always try to make posts and to advertise that information. So my Twitter handle is at Dr. Durkee. That's DrDurkee.
Right.
That's probably the best way to follow, the latest work coming out of my lab. I'm also on Google Scholar for those who want to see our list of publications. If you just type in scholar.google.com, you can just type
Yes.
in my name, Myles Durkee, and you'll see our research that we've been doing on these topics.
Last question. What do you want people, the viewers, to say? What do you want them to get out of this? What would be your closing remark?
Yeah. So I'll start off with saying being Black in America is not easy. Okay. But given all the adversity, all the direct, explicit racism, exclusion, oppression that we've experienced, our culture is just so resilient in the way that we've adapted to still thrive in this society, given all the constraints against us. I mean, that's really what my research core tries to focus on is how Black people adapt in different contexts, in order to be able to thrive in those spaces. And I think that adaptation is just fascinating and that, we still don't know a lot about that adaptation process. And I think code switching is just one of many mechanisms in which Black people and other oppressed and marginalized communities too have learned how to adapt in different spaces in order to get ahead and thrive for both themselves and their families and the communities they represent. So we're trying to learn the best of these practices so that we can, and we're not, by the way, we're not encouraging code switching. All right. So I don't want that image to be, portrayed that,
Okay,
oh,
okay,
code switching, code switching. Like, no, for some people, like, do not code switch. Like, it's not,
okay.
it can be sometimes overly taxing and unhealthy. But for some people, maybe that is a strategy that helps them, in that space. So we're just trying to figure out kind of the best practices for Black people to ultimately thrive
Yeah.
in a variety of different spaces, in spaces within our own community and also spaces in which we may be outnumbered and may be the minority.
I guess one more question. So, if you were to lecture, I know you do, would you, and it's an all Black room, would you tell them, let me tell you what we're up against when you come to the white world? Let's say if you're talking to some college seniors at a HBCU, and okay, they're about to graduate. And this is one of the last classes or the last days of school, and they invite you on. What would you tell them to do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think I would say in the reality, I mean, I think most having talked to a lot of HBCU alums, I think most students at HBCUs, I mean, you kind of already know what to expect. I mean, we know that when we look at now leaving college, entering the corporate world, we know that the vast majority of the corporate world and Fortune 500 companies do not look like us.
Yeah,
Okay.
right, right,
Typically, we're in the minority in a lot of these spaces. So, regardless of whether you went to a predominantly white university or historically Black university, most, college graduates kind of know what they're getting into. They kind of know
right.
what to expect. And I think a lot of people, they start to make preparations before they get there. So that can be interning at a company to see, all right, even though this company looks great on paper, what is that climate on the day-to-day ground level? Like, all
Sure,
right, is it toxic as hell? Is it racist? Or is it more
sure,
of a inclusive space?
sure.
Like that, you'll never get from the website or the diversity statement that every company puts on their website. Like you kind of have to get a footing in there. And even if you're not there on the ground yourself, it's kind of talking to another person of color who's already there to kind of get the real sense of, is this a comfortable space to be in? So I would say ultimately the key is to find spaces that you can thrive in naturally. Okay. So that's ultimately the key. And I realized that for the majority of our college, graduates, a lot of them are going to be pushed into predominantly white spaces. Okay. So it's kind of just, knowing what you're getting into, but at the same time, knowing to what you're willing to tolerate and then not tolerate. All right. So we
Oh, I
don't
love
want,
it.
our alumni to go into spaces that continue to be toxic. And given all the evidence that we have in guidelines for how to make, spaces, more DEI friendly and inclusive, and they just ignore that, then that's a space where, what, it's time to move on to another space.
I got you.
So really kind of that negotiation of how to adapt to different spaces, I would say is key. And it takes experience. I mean, we can give you all the tutorials and guidebooks about how to do that, but ultimately it takes that experience of actually being in that space to now learn in real time what works best for you.
Oh man, very good. Uh, I just had one more question, and they keep coming. And this is the last one. So you run into a student, he tells you my boss is not promoting me, not treating me fairly. I hear these racial tones. Do you also give them some idea of these are the steps to take to combat that as a person without making phone calls? How you deal with that guy or that lady?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, that's a very real life scenario that you just mentioned that, oftentimes too, as we join different organizations and different companies, sometimes we can be pigeonholed where,
Yes.
management may have an expectation of, okay, this is as far as we think you're capable of going. And they start to pigeonhole folks without realizing their true potential, or they get threatened and they're scared that folks might be coming for their positions and their jobs
Right,
and
right,
very
right, right,
protected.
right.
So whenever there's signs of that dynamic happening, I mean, that's really a red flag that maybe you need to go back on the job market, maybe find a transition into a new space. Because at that point, it's very hard to change someone's mind at that point, unfortunately.
Oh,
If they've already
okay.
kind of created a schema about you and where they see is your kind of ceiling, even
Yes,
if all your performance metrics are still showing like, hey, I'm outperforming, meeting everything, they'll find a way to
yes,
justify their bias schema to make it
yes,
make sense for them.
yes,
So in
yes,
that case, then that's just if you ever see any of those red flags or things like that, then one, definitely get a second opinion. So if there's another
yes,
coworker in that space who
yes,
you trust, definitely talk to that person and say, hey, do you see these same signs? I just want to
yes,
make sure maybe it's just their interaction with me. Could be just a simple
yes,
personality dynamic that maybe
yes,
not clashing. But if the other person's like, you know what, let me look into it. And they're like, yeah, I actually did start to notice these same things. And you start to see a pattern, then
yes,
that's an environment that maybe, either if there's someone above that person, maybe getting HR involved can help if you want to stay in the organization, but ultimately
yes.
too, maybe finding a new safer space might
I
also
got
be.
one more. Is racism ever going away?
No, it is not. It is part of it's not. And I don't say that lightheartedly. And I say that based on all the evidence that we know and the science that we've produced thus far. Um, Racism is like a living organism where it continues to evolve and continues to adapt. And it's ingrained in all of our systems within society. Every metric and system and arm of society you can think of, there's racism embedded in it within our policies, our laws, our culture, our perspectives. And it's even socializing the groups that are oppressed to get comfortable with that oppression as well too. So it
Yes,
really takes that education and that introspection and insight to realize, okay, we need to break these systems, right? Because they're trying to make us comfortable the same way that, religion and Christianity was used to make slaves comfortable with slavery, which goes
Yes.
against Christian morals. I mean,
Yes.
capitalism does the same thing to make the groups that are oppressed feel to be more comfortable and complacent with that oppression.
Yes.
And we just find that racism compounds the evils of capitalism. So with that being said, that doesn't still mean that we should just give up and accept it. No, no, no. Like, we're
Okay.
still
Okay.
constantly
Okay.
pushing back against racism. And we
Yes.
are seeing progress. I mean, I think before Barack Obama was elected president, I think if you asked most Black Americans across the country,
Oh,
are we ready
sure.
for a Black president? The vast
Sure.
majority would have said, no, we are not. All right.
Yes. Right. Right. That's
But
true.
then to everyone's, surprise, Barack Obama surpassed all of our expectations,
Yeah. That's right. That's
and
right.
even at the same time, we were all fearful for his life. I mean, I know
That's
me
right. That's right.
every time he gave a speech, I
That's
always
right.
had like this knot in my throat, just very
Yes.
fearful of his safety and his
Yes.
family safety. So I'm so fortunate that, our prayers were answered, that he's been
Yes. That's
protected.
so true. Hey,
But
well,
I'll just say briefly though, I've just, so I'll try
yeah.
to
Go
wrap
ahead.
up.
Go
I
ahead.
have
Go
a
ahead.
whole
Go ahead.
course. I have a whole course designed about
Yes.
challenging racism. So I can talk about this for hours. But I just want to say that we're constantly pushing back against racism, and things are changing. I mean, we're seeing just if we go about 5 years back, diversity, equity, and inclusion was not talked about nowhere near to the extent on executive boards and in corporations to the degree that it is now. So we are seeing progress, and we're seeing that companies are starting to realize that once you diversify, it actually makes your company more profitable. Okay. Because now you're introducing diverse perspectives that can help you catch problems earlier and help you expand your company and grow to different markets that you may not know about or may not have that cultural capital or awareness to know how to market your product to that group. So ultimately, diversity is effective. All right. But with that said, when you first start to diversify, you're going to run into a lot of conflict. It's going to be stressful. It's going to be tough because people aren't ready or used to change. So as you're diversifying, you're going to have kind of the old guard or, the gatekeepers who might be uncomfortable with that and not know how to push forward with that. So diversity doesn't always, and social justice and, change doesn't always happen easy and seamlessly. Like, it requires a push, a struggle, a fight. But in the end result, I mean, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, the history of social justice is a very long arc, but it arcs towards the side of equality. So ultimately, we are going to see that progress. But with that, we are going to see different periods of regression. I think we're in one of those periods of regression right now with a
Oh
lot of
yeah. Sure. Sure. Sure.
God. But that should, at least for me, it inspires me and other researchers too to kind of push back harder and design new ways in which we can, ultimately move that needle forward.
Yeah. Sure. Hey, everybody! I told you you're gonna love this show. I had questions, and my man was popping answers like boom, 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 and I got more. Man, I tell you, this was good. This is what I do with Strong Inspirations. I bring on these experts, these geniuses to come on the show, and I'm so happy that they take time out of their busy schedules to do such. We're going to keep going here at Strong Inspirations because it's gentlemen and ladies who come on here that tell the story. I just kind of ask as best I can some intelligent questions. I thank you so very much, my friend, to coming on the show, to sharing that. I love what you're doing. You on the side of right. You spending your time lecturing, and I know you're reaching some of them students, both black and white, to think a little bit differently. And that's moving the needle in itself. There's no question that the university and throughout the sphere in which you are in contact of, it's worth the money. I can feel it. It's been my pleasure to have you on the show, everybody. Anthony Brogdon here, like I said, once again, get a copy of my book. Get ready for my movie. Follow me on Twitter and just go to the website, businessintheblack.net. And to you, my brother, I say I want you to stay strong, stay safe, stay on your grind. I love what you're doing.
I
Thank you
appreciate it.
so very much for coming on. Peace and
Thank you
love.
so much, Anthony. I appreciate the invitation. It was a great conversation with you. I
Yeah,
really
it
enjoyed it.
was. Very much. Thank you.